Okay, well, it's good to see you all. I'm glad you're here. Welcome back. This is Dr. Patrick Lockwood. Not live, but good to be here regardless. And, we're going to try a new setup. We're going to try a new approach. We'll see if it works. If it doesn't work, then screw it. We'll go back to recording um, the old fashioned way without video, see how it goes. So it's good to see you all. Glad you're all back. And I wanted to just drop by and leave some thoughts about our current madness here in September of 2020. It's a weird time we live in. There's fires everywhere on the West Coast where I am, and there's just a lot of weird, a lot of weird. So what I'd like to do is I'd like to maybe help us make sense of the weird. And I want to go back to the 1930s because I think a lot of what we need and what we need to know is not new, it's actually old. And some of this is intuitive and some of this is not so intuitive. So I want to go back and frame all this. So right now we have election nonsense, we have fire nonsense, we have racism to deal with, we have, looting and rioting, we have all sorts of just there's just a lot going on. And people are constantly being challenged nowadays to reassess the way they see themselves and the way they understand concepts like structural racism, for instance. I've had a number of conversations with colleagues and friends and people that are close to me about the concept, and I notice that there's differing pushback. Um, and, it's if you're not used to reading about it or you don't have a sense of, you know, where the concept comes from, I think that it makes a lot of people automatically kind of go, whoa, I don't know about that. So, what I wanted to talk about, not specifically structural racism, but what I talk about is like, what do we really know? How do we really know it? And how do we take in new information? Because for many people now, I'd say you're taking in a lot of new information. And I don't think it's weird that people feel uncomfortable, they feel challenged, and that they don't want to admit that something makes sense because, let's say, it challenges their pre existing beliefs. In fact, that's what we call cognitive dissonance. It's the experience of taking in new information that directly confronts or challenges a pre existing belief, and it makes one kind of lose their mind and kind of feel, you know, uncomfortable, anxious, irritable, etc. And it usually provokes some kind of defensive response where you ignore new information, you minimize it, you put it down, you just challenge it and don't give it any credence. And this is normal for all people, and for some people it happens a lot more, for other people it happens less. Um, so the first concept is cognitive dissonance, and many people on the left, on the right, in the middle, everywhere are experiencing a great deal of cognitive dissonance about Donald Trump and vaccines and everything else in between. And I find that we're going to face a lot more of this the closer we get to the election. The second thing I think we need to understand is back to the 1930s, a lot of what we need to understand to grow and heal and change as a community, as a society, other than my grassroots approach to things, which I talk about all the time on Twitter, I think what we really need to understand is how we work. And I've gone to great lengths in different, videos and my book over there, right back there. I've gone to great lengths to try and um, give us the basics and do it in such a way that we can kind of make better decisions. And one thing I think that's been drastically missing is an understanding of how we take in new information. And I didn't do a good job of that so far in my book. So I want to just explain a little bit right now, and then we can play with the idea more in future videos and future discussions with people. So let's start right now and do our best to kind of go over one of the most, I'd say, maybe universal principles in developmental psychology, cognitive psychology that most people generally agree with in the field. I know there's general, there's some squabbles here and there, but most people agree with this. So let's talk about these concepts from Piaget, Jean Piaget. He originally studied at the Binet lab in the 1920s, Stanford Binet, the Binet intelligence test, and he kind of started to notice that kids develop at different stages and different phases. And there's his different kind of cognitive developmental stages that aren't really relevant for this particular discussion, but worth looking up, especially if you have kids. And more broadly, I think there are three concepts from Piaget that Piaget kind of pioneered. Not that these words or these ideas didn't exist before, but that he really kind of formalized them in a developmental psychology sense that allowed us to kind of make sense of how kids grow and learn and how all people grow and learn. So the first concept is a schema. The second concept is assimilation. And the third concept is accommodation. And what's important about these concepts as a whole, as a unified group of concepts, is they explain a lot of variance, I would say, in learning and taking in new information. And I think the fourth concept would be cognitive dissonance. So your emotional affective response whenever you take in new information. So I think information that challenges your pre-existing beliefs. So I think using these four concepts, we can have a pretty educated but simple conversation about what we're struggling with right now. So first, let me give you the standard definitions for many of these concepts, these three concepts, and then we'll move on to like how they apply right now. So something that sticks out to me is the concept of a schema. And then this shows up in my clinical work, this shows up in my educational work, it shows up in pretty much every facet of my life, professionally and personally, because I think that there are many, cognitive science, neuroscience debates about how information is learned and crystallized. Is it neural nets? Is it schemas? What is it? But I think a schema is a good heuristic for most people to work with in terms of how their brain makes sense of information. So, according to Piaget, a schema is, I'm just going to read a quote here, a schema is a cohesive, repeatable action sequence processing component actions that are tightly interconnected and governed by a core meaning. So let me say that one more time a little more cohesively. So a schema is a cohesive, repeatable action sequence processing component actions that are tightly interconnected and governed by a core meaning. So in Piaget's developmental psych sense, a schema was this blueprint, if you want to think of it like that, for making sense of a goal and an action and doing it over and over and over again. So if you saw a child reach out for like a cup, for instance, take a drink, put it back down. As the child is learning and growing, they are creating a blueprint in their head of what it means, mechanically speaking, from body, sensory kind of perspectives, to reach out, grab this thing, do it, deal with the weight, if there's water sloshing around, all that stuff, and then put it back down. And all the mechanics, sensory things that go along with that. Now, the great thing is this concept of a schema works at multiple levels of abstraction, and it works for multiple cognitive processes too. So the schema works in a behavioral sense, but it also works in a cognitive sense in the idea that we take in a new concept like microphone, and you have no pre-existing concept for it. So what you do is you have to kind of assemble, or out of an abstraction concept, you'd have to like pull it all together and make up something that's cohesive, that's repeatable. So the repeatable sense of a microphone is it's constantly this thing that takes in sound and projects it or records it, etc. By processing the component actions of the cohesive whole. So there's different component parts, there's different component actions to reach out and grab the mug, right? So a schema works in a number of different ways. So it's kind of a blueprint for the different component parts of a thing that we have crystallized to be a thing, essentially. So it's the blueprint that holds the glue together of what we call a thing, an idea, right? So we have a schema for race, we have a schema for sex, we have a schema for microphone, we have a schema for person, we have a schema for whatever, right? It's this blueprint, be slightly more elaborated than what we would consider a definition, right? So there's a core meaning. That person means, technically speaking, mammal that walks in a bipedal motion that has consciousness and all this fluff, right? Beyond just mere primate. And microphone has this meaning of, mechanical device that takes in sound or reverberates with sound that amplifies it or transmits it to another location, that kind of thing. So core meaning, component parts, being processed together. That's a schema, right? So this schema can be changed via two processes. The first process is assimilation. The second process is accommodation. So, in the simplest of terms, assimilation and accommodation are kind of two sides of the same coin. And they serve very similar purposes. They don't have, I mean, they one modifies, the other doesn't, but they have very similar purposes in terms of updating your meaning about something, elaborating your meaning about something, a schema, typically speaking. So, generally speaking, let's talk about assimilation first. Assimilation is when you take in a new idea and you have to fit that idea into a pre existing schema for that core concept. So, for instance, you may have a pre existing schema about race. And your pre existing schema about race may involve a social component, it may involve a biological component, and it may involve a cultural component. But the truth of the matter is, the more you read about the concept of race, the more you understand it's a social construction, because generally speaking, there are basically no real biological components to race. Race is basically a social construct, and the only reason that it's reified is because people keep reifying it. Like, there's no need for the construct in reality, it seems like, but people see it as a biopsychosocial construct, even though it's predominantly a social construct. At the core of it, it's different because you look different in terms of, typically speaking, skin color and certain facial characteristics and things like that. But there's also a cultural component too, and you can't disentangle the culture from the social, from the psychological, from the biological. And the problem for me is, when it comes to like a concept like race, when people are confronted with new books, new articles, etc., about concepts like race, for instance, do we use assimilation? Do we take in that new information that challenges your pre-existing view that, once upon a time we thought, Asian person meant someone who looks a certain way in terms of their face, in terms of the language that they speak, and in terms of skin color? Like, is that all that means? Because for a lot of people, that is exactly what race means. That may be what race means for the vast majority of people. But once you learn more about, let's say, the biology of race, for instance, you learn that there's almost nothing there, right? So when you take in that information, what do you do with it? That is the real challenge we face. What do you do with that new information? So if you're assimilating it, you have to take in that information and make it make sense from the point of view of biology. You have to make it make sense from the point of view of when and where did you learn about race and what it was, right? Because some people have zero, let's say, technical, formal education about like sociological constructs like race. They have, they had a history book, or they had nothing, right? So that's assimilation. You take in new information and you make it fit what you already know about race. So if you were a person who learned that race is a biological thing, and then there's a cultural component and a social component to it, then if you're really doing assimilation correctly, then what you're doing is you're going, oh, okay, so this biological thing I thought was real is not really a big deal anymore. Maybe it accounts for 0.0001% of what race really is. Maybe the vast majority of it is some kind of social, cultural, psychological construct, if that makes sense. So that's assimilation. I hope that makes sense. So you take in new information and it kind of, let's say, fits in what you already know. So it's not to say that biology disappeared. It's just to say that biology became so small, it's almost irrelevant. So then there's accommodation. So accommodation is where the new knowledge is so substantial that you actually have to change the schema that exists, right? So a good example of accommodation is something to the effect of, I'm going to use Donald Trump because he's the easiest example. So you hate the guy, which many people do. I don't personally get that. I don't prefer him. I don't like him. I'm not planning to Anyways, all that aside, I'm trying not to hate anyone. Anyways, he has all sorts of qualities that people can't stand, and then there are people who love him for other qualities. So if you have a schema, if you're in the group of people, it seems like a fairly large group of people in the United States at least, that cannot stand him, and you take in this new information. Let's just say that we find out that everything about the Russia whatever is completely a hoax. It's confirmed by everyone from CNN to um, Nancy Pelosi to every person who hates the guy. That we were so wrong. We were sold a bill of goods. I'm so sorry. I can't imagine it. Okay? So if you've had this idea in your head that Donald Trump is a terrible person who cheated his way into the White House through like being buddies with other operatives and all this stuff in Russia and whatever, and you now learn that it's literally all bunk, and everyone agrees, but you're still holding on to it, that is a failure of accommodation. Because what's supposed to happen is the moment everyone confirms that it wasn't really Russia and nothing really happened and it was all political hoax by Obama or whatever to hurt the guy and not let him get in the office, the moment you learn that that's true, you are supposed to accommodate that schema that Trump is a cheater, right? So you have a Trump is a cheater schema, so to speak, in your head. And that Trump is a cheater schema has to automatically be accommodated once everyone confirms that the information you don't want to hear is there. And that will produce what we call cognitive dissonance. It'll make you uncomfortable. It'll make you want to challenge it. It'll make you want to rationalize why that's wrong, why all these people are in on it. Trump paid them off, whatever it is, right? But you have to take in that new information. And it has to change your Trump is a cheater schema. And you need to accommodate that schema. It needs to shift to the point that maybe you start to not see him as a cheater. Or maybe you start to see his cheating as more like narrowly defined in certain circumstances, not in the political endeavor, right? Because that, I think, is a problem that we all face now politically, not just with Trump, but with everyone. If you're left, you hate the right people, or they're all bad, or whatever. If you're right, you don't like the lefties, they're all bad, they all cheat, they all voter fraud, whatever. So there's room for assimilation and accommodation in our modern day world, and we don't do it. We don't do enough of either, it seems like. I think what happens for the most part is people live in some kind of silo. They watch their news channel, they find their YouTube commentator that they like, not excluding me, and they just listen to that person like that talking head, that cult of personality is going to fix them and have the right idea. And that can't be true. That can't be true at all. Because people are fallible. So what we need to constantly be doing is negotiating these four concepts: schema, cognitive dissonance, assimilation, and accommodation. Because it seems like we're not doing that. And it seems like people everywhere are having a very hard time either fitting information they don't like into a schema that exists. So if there's a schema of good person and Donald Trump fits into it in this one category because he did this good thing, you need to put him in that category. He needs to live in that schema. You need to assimilate that. Or, I'm just going to keep using Trump because he's the easy example. Or, in the purpose of accommodation, if you have a Trump as a cheater schema, and that schema is now confronted with reality, with facts that clearly he did not cheat in X circumstance, you now have to change that schema. And if you don't, you're failing, and your cognitive dissonance, the discomfort with information that conflicts with you already believe to be true, is now winning. And we have a huge cognitive dissonance problem. And it's on every side. It's in every institution in the United States. It's in every government, because we are primitive. We are not sophisticated. And this is why I have pioneered the primitive unity concept. Pioneered is extremely egotistical. Let me walk that back for a second, because I realize how insane that sounds. I have started discussing the concept of primitive unity because I think we have more in common than we pay attention to. And if we pay close attention to the fact that we're all people, we all need to eat, we all need to sleep, we all have a desire for status, we all have a desire for safety, we all have a desire for all the basics in life. We all have a desire for these things. Some of us stronger than others for different things, but generally speaking, we all have these same desires. So if we don't start uniting in our common humanity in our common primitive animal humanity, basically, then we're going to be screwed. So we need to get our shit together. And I think one of the ways that we can collectively start getting our shit together better is by paying attention to if we're effectively assimilating enough or accommodating enough, and if our cognitive biases are getting in the way. And if you're not quite sure about your biases, I did a video on that a while ago. I also did my HTTP series, which you can watch. But we need to start paying attention better to assimilation, to accommodation, and to cognitive dissonance, because our schemas are never going to change, and they have to constantly be updated because we're constantly taking in more and more information all the time. Much of that information is bunk, but some of it's real, and you gotta let it change the way you think, because if we don't change our minds, we are fucked. And on that note, I hope you have a good night. Please like, share, subscribe, follow me on Twitter. Buy my book, The Fear Problem, up there on the bookshelf on Amazon. Support Jeff Bezos, I guess. And have a good night. Be well. Thanks so much.